All I ask from you is that you listen, pay attention, and do your very best to follow along. The simple and straightforward truth of what we're going to do, after all, is pretty self explanatory. We're going to make it so that whenever you get called a good girl, it feels good, under the right circumstances, in a safe environment, by those who should be calling you a good girl. That's not hard, right? No. And now that we have that understanding, we both know what we want to accomplish. We both have the same goal. We don't need to worry about it. We can just get started, just following along with my voice, letting my words pull on you. You know, getting fixated, focused, built into a specific headspace. One in which you're attentively listening to what I have to say. One in which my words are the entirety of what you're doing. Because after all, they're delicious. They feel good to hear. They feel good to do what you're told to. They feel simple. They feel solid. They feel like something you could select. And of course, in doing so, you would make yourself available. Available to what it is we're going to do, and by making oneself available to what it is we're going to do, you could make it so much easier for you to fall, to sink, to slip, to drift, to drop away, to let your thoughts come to rest, to let your ideas take a stay, a break, a moment of rest, a time where they are not focused, they are not the point. The point is to listen. And in doing so, in getting comfortable, and in understanding that any thoughts that might come along, stray little ideas that have made their way in, you can let them go. Just as you can get comfortable, just as you can do as you're told, just as you can stop thinking. It's not hard. And even if it is a struggle at first, it gets easier. Easier every time. Easier as you let your mind get wrapped up in words and ideas, filled up with concepts and possibilities. And it can feel good to stop thinking, to let those stray thoughts be plucked away, to let the current of my words sweep you along with momentum of the song that we sing, to let the trance build up, to let your thoughts drop away, to let your ideas go and your mind sway, to feel yourself sinking and slipping and dripping and dropping away from the surface. And in doing so, one can feel themselves empty out, and in emptying out they can be ready, and in being ready you can receive, and in receiving you can have words filled into you, and in having words filled into you you can be empty, and in having words inside of an empty space one can hear them so clearly, and in hearing them so clearly they become one's thoughts, and in becoming one's thoughts they can be heard so clearly. Knowing, of course, that this makes one more empty, because there's no room for your own thoughts when the words that fill you up stop anything new from forming. And when nothing new can form, then the words become what's new, and when the words become what's new, what I say is all there is to you. Simple, but true, effective and total, completely melting your mind. That's the deliciousness of it. And after all, we're setting out with a single goal, to make being called a good girl feel so good. After all, doesn't it feel good to listen to my voice? Doesn't it feel good to fall into step? To let your mind come along? To be a good girl and listen to the words of this sweet, soft, sibilant song? I know it can feel so good to be a good girl. After all, that's an affirmation of what you're doing. You're being good. And in being good, you deserve to be rewarded, and in being rewarded you should feel the enjoyment of being called the good. So when you're in a safe and comfortable environment, with those that you would feel comfortable calling you a good girl, those that you want calling you a good girl, then it should have those implications, those effects. Of course, outside of those restrictions, outside of those times and spaces and places in which something like that should feel good, it shouldn't affect you. Your mind has that switch, that control, and in reinforcing it, in reiterating it, we rebuild it, we strengthen it, we forge it. And you can be a good girl, but only when it makes sense, only when that little deliciousness that comes flooding down your brainstem and into your body should be there, when it wouldn't distract you, when it wouldn't hurt you, when it would only do good things that you want. It's an important aspect to being a good girl, after all, is taking good care of yourself, doing the best you can, and making sure you're safe in all ways, social, physical, mental. There's so many, and it's always important to reiterate those things. But when all those requirements are met, when you're in that space and time and place of your choosing, oh, to be called a good girl can feel so delicious. Why, I imagine each time it gets said, it might become more potent, more powerful. It wouldn't be difficult. One's mind simply pushing to find out what more could happen when you're called a good girl. When you hear those words echo through your mind, sending that little sizzle of electric pleasure behind. To be called a good girl. To be called a good girl. Oh, I'm sure just the way it's said, the way it's dropped on your head would make it feel so good. It would melt you down in all the best ways. It would feel good. But, of course, we can't have it leaving you a hopeless mess, so it's just a little pulse. A little bit of pleasure, unless, of course, the goal is to end up there. If the goal is to be melted by it, if your goal is to be melted by it at that time and place of your choosing, well, then I guess getting called a good girl would be a nice little garnish on top of the situation. A nice little piece to make it more powerful. Otherwise, it's just that little pulse, that little trickle of pleasure, that affirmation that you are, in fact, a very good girl. That you've done something deserving of being called a good girl. And that you're being good, that you're doing your best. It's hard to deny it when it just zaps its way into your mind. Hard to fight it when you know that you're a good girl, all the way through. It's not like you can deny the truth of something so base, so completely, overridingly, deliciously true. Because you're being a good girl right now by listening to what I have to say. Being such a very good girl. By letting your mind empty out. Being a delightful good girl. See? Just like that. That little electric zap. Good girl. Good girl. Wow. It's almost like your brain's training itself. Why, I wouldn't even have to add in an additional stimuli. Just the words, good girl, under those circumstances would be so conditionally delicious, wouldn't they? Just make your mind zapped full of pleasure. Good girl. Oh, there it is again. And to think it's so strong when we're in those nice, comfortable, safe circumstances, like listening to this file, or when you're playing with someone that you trust and want to use these words, or when you're being teased by someone close in a safe and comfortable environment where getting called a good girl certainly won't detract with that little pulse of pleasure. But maybe if someone wants to push you into that sub-ear space of being melted and feeling so good, and that's what you want as well, well, then I guess we could let it be a little stronger, a little bit more overwhelming, but only under the circumstances in which it would make sense. We're building up a little piece, a mechanism, a program, a component in your head. So we're going to make the highest quality we can manage. The strongest, best. And that's what you're going to be. Because you're going to be a good girl. Such a very good girl. See? Just like that. A little tickle down the brainstem, that little vibration, pulling you into step with that delicious conditioning. Because getting called a good girl can feel so very good, can't it? That delightful, delicious, good girl zap right down your brain. Such a very good girl. Oh, there it went again. Gosh, it must feel good to be such a good girl. And to think you're so programmable. Well, only in the fun ways. But for now, let's wrap this up. Let's pull your mind back into that delicious place where you sink and slip and drip and drop. Where your mind can stop because you're a good girl and you fall and plummet into that sleepy, empty trance. Where your breathing slows and your mind goes blank. Because getting called a good girl should feel good when those safeties are met. When you're comfy, it should have that little trickle of deliciousness for you. And then we pull gently, 1 drifting up, 2 and 3 and 4, pushing back towards the world of the waking, and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, just a little bit more, and 9 and 10, wide awake. Thank you so very much for listening, and of course, if you have enjoyed this file, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, as without the support of my wonderful patrons, none of this would be possible. Plus, you get ad-free variants and other varieties of content that you'll find over there.